Okay, there's a bit of a problem that I've seen in the comment section below. People have heard that when you plug an M.2 into the top slot of your motherboard, like this one over there, you're gonna lose some of the other connectivity on the motherboard, which is not right, but it's also true, but it's not right. But basically, there's something going on in there which is called PCIe switching, and it sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't happen. But as a creator, it's very important to understand what is PCIe switching, when does it happen, and when do you lose some of the bandwidth to some of the other components, and when do you not? So in this video, I'm gonna tackle that question. And it doesn't matter if you've never heard of PCIe before, you're probably gonna understand what is going on. So next time you upgrade some of the components in your PC, you're gonna know what's going on and if you're gonna lose any features or not. Part of this video is sponsored by AMD Threadripper Pro. More about it later on in the video or in the description below. So firstly, we need to take a little step back and talk about PCIe lanes. Now, if you don't know what PCIe lanes are and how do they work, what are the different generations, Gen 4, Gen 5, well, like why does some CPU support Gen 5, some Gen 4, then I highly recommend my PCIe lane tutorial that I've made on the channel. I'm going to explain everything in detail in there. Whether you've heard about PCIe lanes before or not, you're going to understand how do these work in your motherboard and why there are some things like that. So I highly recommend going checking out that video first. But then secondly, what we need to talk about is the difference between PCIe lanes from the CPU and from the chipset. So what I have over here is the Threadripper 5000WX motherboard, and this is the Sage Wi-Fi 2. This is the newer version of this, but basically there's two places where the PCIe lanes can come from. They can come from the chipset, which is over here, or the CPU. Now this is the same exactly so with some other motherboards. For example, this one here is the Phantom Gaming motherboard from ASRock, and here we have a chipset in here, and then some of these PCIe lanes come from the chipset, and then some of them come from the CPU. So here's what's going on. Each CPU platform supports certain amount of PCIe lanes. So when we're looking at the Threadripper 5000 here, this supports a whopping 128 PCIe 4.0 lanes from the CPU. All of those lanes are directly connected to the CPU, which would be over there. Then if we're looking at the likes of Ryzen 7000, then these CPUs have 24 PCIe lanes on the CPU, and these are PCIe 5.0 lanes. Now there's actually a little trick here. This is actually 20 plus 4 PCIe lanes. So why is that plus 4 there, and what does that mean? And AMD shows that actually on all of their specs that this is 20 plus 4. So that plus 4 lanes is actually the 4 PCIe lanes that connect the CPU to the chipset. So there is actually a connection between the chipset and the CPU. Imagine like some wires that go across. So whatever is connected to the chipset essentially and eventually has to connect to the CPU. Otherwise, you won't be able to access any of that information. So whether it's SATA ports, some of the PCIe slots, some of the M.2 slots, if they're connected to the chipset, because you've run out of PCIe lanes on the CPU, for example, then this is connected to the CPU. And AMD uses something called PCIe lanes actually as well to connect to the CPU. So there's 20 that come from the CPU, and then 4 that's connected to the chipset, and then chipset has extra lanes, but because you're not always using all of the connected things at the same time, for example, your Ethernet or your PCIe expansion slot there, or M.2 or a few M.2s on the chipset, we can get away with just a few PCIe lanes between the CPU and the chipset. Now, with Intel, it's very similar, but slightly different at the same time. So here we have the Z790 chipset, and there's some M.2s here connected to the chipset. And then Intel uses something called DMI connection with the CPU. So there is still a connection between here, the CPU and the chipset. Now, between different generations of CPUs, that might change how they're connecting the chipset to the CPU, but there always will be some kind of connection there. But what you need to understand and remember is that the connection between the chipset and the CPU is always not the full length of what connects to the chipset There's a smaller connection. Imagine this as like a lot of streams that flow into the chipset of data, whether from m.2s or from some of the I/O from the back or SATA ports, something goes to the chipset. And then there's a little river that triggers back to the CPU. So Intel actually has 16 plus 4 usable lanes on the Z790 or 14th gen, for example, or any of the 12th, 13th, 14th gen. And that 16 plus 4 isn't actually the same as AMD's 20 plus 4, because Intel has 16 PCIe Gen 5 lanes and 4 PCIe Gen 4 lanes. AMD has actually 20 PCIe Gen 5, and then the plus 4 is for chipset, if that makes sense. But here's the problem. I'll show you this here. So I've got an Intel motherboard over here. If I'm gonna connect an M.2 on the top slot over here, suddenly I'm gonna lose half of the bandwidth of the first PCIe slot, which usually is used for GPU. So suddenly this is not 16 lanes in there, but 8 lanes in there. But if we're looking at another motherboard over here, this is the X670E ProArt from ASUS. If I'm gonna plug an M.2 on the top slot there, whether it's Gen 5 or Gen 4, absolutely nothing's gonna happen. And I'm still gonna have full 16 lanes bandwidth for this first PCIe slot in there. And you might be saying, wait a second, why is this like that? How can I find out if my motherboard has that or not? I've seen a few comments in the comment section saying that, oh, I'm not sure if my ProArt Z790 motherboard is going to lose the bandwidth if I'm going to put an M.2 SSD on the top slot. And the answer is no. But how do you find out that information? Before I show you how to find this information, let's talk about the AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5000 series, which doesn't actually have any of the PCIe lane switching issues. No need to worry about where you plug things in, it's always gonna run at full speed. AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5000WX series offers up to 64 cores and 128 threads, which offers unmatched multi-core CPU performance for creators. For programs like Blender, Cinema 4D, V-Ray, and many others, the 5995WX holds the clear lead in the market. It features 128 PCIe 4.0 lanes for the ultimate expandability. Whether you need to run 8 GPUs or expand your storage to oblivion, Threadripper's got you covered. No more PCIe lane switching. Go check out my world record benchmark score in DaVinci Resolve achieved with the Threadripper Pro 5995WX. Couldn't do it without it. Check out Threadripper Pro 5000WX series CPUs in the description below and see how they can improve your workflow. Well, that information you can find out in the motherboard manual. Now, you might have a manual in the box in paper form, but there's always an updated manual on the homepage of your motherboard's website. Whether it's ProArt or WRX Pro Series from ASUS or Gigabyte or ASRock or MSI, whichever one, there is a motherboard online as well where you can check. Not all motherboard manufacturers do this, but some of them do, but this is easier to understand what's going on in there. If they don't have a block diagram, which I'm going to explain in a minute what there is, they will show you tips like when you plug in something in the top slot, some switching is going to keep going there. It's called PCIe switching. And then how this is going to affect the performance in some of the other expansion slots, either in there or some other places. They will explain this there. So highly recommend kind of browsing through the manual and then seeing like, okay, I'm gonna install an M.2 slot. So go to the M.2 selection there or expansion slots on the motherboard and you'll understand something in there. But here I want to use this ASRock Z790 Riptide Wi-Fi motherboard manual here as an example because they've done a very good job explaining this here. So in this motherboard, you've got this here, which is the block diagram. And block diagram basically explains and shows you how all of these different I/O ports and expansion slots and all of the different headers and ports are connected to the CPU or to the motherboard. And here we can see that this top bit here is the actual CPU. So we can see what's connected to the CPU and some of the I/O. You can see that there's the display port and HDMI from the back of the motherboard that comes straight to the CPU. Then we can see the M.2 M.2-1 is connected to the CPU. So we've got PCIe Gen 4 X4 lanes. So this is the +4 lanes on the Intel here connected to the CPU. Then we've got some DDR5 slots that are connected directly to the CPU, which makes sense as well. But here, this bit is what's getting interesting here. So basically, because Intel CPU here, the 14th gen or 13th or 12th gen, only has 16 PCIe Gen 5 lanes. But if you want to add another PCIe Gen 5 storage option, which this top slot here actually provides, then something's gonna have to give somewhere, because we only have 16 PCIe lanes. And this explains exactly what happens. So you can see that there is Gen 5 lane here, and you can see there's little arrows here between these two things here. Okay, so this is what's called PCIe switching. So if you have something connected only to this top slot here, then you will have the full PCIe Gen 5 X16 bandwidth of the GPU. But there is a little switch in there as well that goes to the secondary slot in there. So if you plug anything into the secondary slot, then suddenly there's a switch that switches the first lane from 16 to 8. So you've got only 8 in the top and then 8 in the bottom. That's PCIe Gen 5 lanes. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated. I'll add a little section here that when you have your graphics card, then the graphics card generation right now, there isn't a graphics card out there that has PCIe Gen 5 interface on the actual graphics card. So the graphics cards are most likely X8 or X16. X16 is the more popular. X16 PCIe Gen 4 lanes. So what will happen is if you put your PCIe Gen 4 X16 card into this slot and you plug something else on the bottom slot as well, perhaps another graphics card. Now, they are not going to start to run at X8 Gen 5 speed because the graphics card doesn't support Gen 5. They'll start to run now at X8. So you've got 8 lanes of PCIe Gen 4 going to the graphics card in the top slot and on the bottom slot, because it switches that, which means that you might lose some of the bandwidth on your graphics card or whatever, you know, peripheral you have plugged in into there, if it actually can utilize all of the 16 lanes, but now can only push all the data through the 8 lanes, which just is, you know, smaller road to push all the data through, which might cause some performance issues. How much? That's for another video. But there is another switch here. As you can see, there's like 2 or 3 switches. There's 2 arrows here. The other switch is that if you have something plugged into the top slot here, you will lose this main slot, 16 slots, again to X8. So whether you've got something plugged into there or to the top slot, it doesn't matter if it's Gen 5 or not, you will lose the bandwidth of this top slot there. And that's what is called a PCIe switching. So knowing that, that's very, very important. For example, if you don't need a Gen 5 SSD, then I highly recommend not using the top slot, but using the secondary slot, which still goes to the CPU here, but you will get only Gen 4 lanes, but Gen 4 SSDs are still very, very good, and you will get the full bandwidth to the CPU, which basically is better because you don't have the latency issues. If you plug it in something like on the third slot here, there's an M.2 slot in there. What will happen is that data now travels to the chipset and then through the small canal between the chipset to the CPU, which just is a longer way around and latency issues and so on. You want always the OS SSD, the M.2 SSD, what you have on your motherboard, to connect to the CPU. That will give you the best and quickest performance, less lag and less going around, and all the other data, whether that's project drives or others, they're kind of like secondary priority, because if the OS is laggy, everything else is laggy, because that's where the programs and OS is running on. But all the rest, they can go through the chipset and find their own time. And that's the best performance way basically there. And then as you can see here, we've got this big chipset. And then they've got another chipset here on this motherboard where they've connected some other things into it. They've added another little chipset, but that connects to the chipset as well. So basically there's another whole thing that's going on. And then you can see that this chipset here, all these other things, like all the headers, 2.0 headers from the USB and front panel headers and all sorts of headers and things, they connected to the chipset. And then from the chipset, boom, to the CPU through these DMI Gen 4 X8 lanes between there. Now, in this motherboard, we don't have actually any other switches, as you can see. So all the rest of the things that go through the chipset, they go directly onto the chipset and you don't lose anything else in there. But this is not all, because the AMD Ryzen 7000 has actually more PCIe lanes. Well, there's still 20, but the 4 that goes usually to the m.2 slot. On Intel, we have it at PCIe Gen 4, but on AMD, we have it at PCIe Gen 5, which means that even if you plug something else into the top slot here, this will still be PCIe Gen 5 speeds or bandwidth, which means you're not going to lose any bandwidth on the top slot here or anywhere else. Now, there are still some switching going on when you get to the other m.2 slots SSDs there, but on AMD platform right now, you can use a Gen 5 SSD and it will run at full speed and you're not going to lose anything else there. But these are some of the, mainstream or low-end desktops, what I'd like to call them. There is something else called a high-end desktop, which is HEDT platform, which what we have in here. So this is basically workstation or high-end desktop. There's not a clear borderline there, which is which. But basically, what happens here is now the AMD THREADRIPPER CPU, which I have here, has 128 PCIe lanes going to the CPU, which is, as you can see, quite a bit more than our Intel's mainstream platform, and also quite a bit more than the Ryzen 7000 CPU, which takes this platform to a whole nother level, because you might have, but most likely you don't have any problems with the PCIe lane switching. And most of the things on the motherboard, what you need the speed of, are connected directly to the CPU. For example, if you plug something into the top slot, boom, X16 lanes to the CPU. The same with the second bit over here. Third, fourth slot. You're thinking, wait a second, how many graphics cards can you run then at full speed? Well, quite a lot, depending on your motherboard. I think this motherboard, one of the slots runs at X8 speeds, rather than all of them X16. But basically, you can run about 8 graphics card, full 16 Gen 4 PCIe lane bandwidth to the CPU, and you're not gonna lose any of the bandwidth, which makes this AMD THREADRIPPER completely in another league. Now, Intel has released the Xeon. This is the 4th Gen Xeon, and this is the 3475X, what I have here. And this one does have 112 PCIe Gen 5 lanes. So as you can see, slightly less than the THREADRIPPER, but these are PCIe Gen 5 lanes. Now, if you do need the PCIe Gen 5 storage, you can definitely go for that one, but the platform right now costs a little bit more than the THREADRIPPER. And why this THREADRIPPER 5000 series is actually absolutely incredible buy if you need some insane storage. Here's what I mean. Let's say you are a video editor, renderer, or whatever you're doing, you need like 2 GPUs. Okay, whack 2 GPUs in there, 1, 2, you still have plenty of other expandability. You can put a whole nother 10 gigabit card in there. Maybe this is a dual for 10 gigabit card. You can put that one in there. You're not going to lose any bandwidth. Capture card, no problem. Add another bit of storage, because this motherboard comes with the Asus Hyper m.2 expansion card for m.2s. So let's say you do need some more m.2s. What you can use is this card here, which is only 1 slot thick. It has 4 m.2s inside. You plug them in there, slot this card maybe into the bottom slot there, boom, add some more in there, and you can create incredible amount of storage of m.2s, and you're not going to lose any of the bandwidth, or you're not going to be like, okay, some of the m.2s are now running half the speed, or the top m.2. Everything is running just the full speed, and there's basically the end of PCIe switching. Now, this is THREADRIPPER 5000, which supports DDR4, and right now is probably very affordable because the new generation of 7000 has just been launched. Now, the 7000 THREADRIPPER, stay tuned for that video, because when we get those samples in, this is a whole nother level, because now we have 128 PCIe Gen 5 lanes. So basically, we just doubled the bandwidth what this can do. I mean, there isn't yet a PCIe 5 peripherals out there. Imagine we have this card here, but, well, I hope Asus is going to do that, or some other people. We're going to have this card as PCIe Gen 5 card. You can put 4 PCIe Gen 5, SSDs in there, slot it in there, nothing's going to change. And you can do that 8 times. So you can have 8 of these cards with PCIe 5 storage. So that would be 8 times 4. That's 32 PCIe Gen 5 slots on your motherboard. And you're still not going to make any switches or something else. You still have the full chipset that's connected to the CPU to get extra storage. So you have 32 m.2 slots. Let's say we can get this up to 8 terabytes at some point. That is incredible amount of storage with just connected to one CPU platform without losing anything. So the conclusion of this video is, think about what you need for your creator PC, or perhaps some other productivity or high-end workstation PC if you're building this. When you're upgrading this, it's very good to know where your PCIe lanes are and how this is routed, how the PCIe lane switching is going on, how the block diagram works, so you know what to do. So if you're on the Intel platform, you have the least options there, what you can do to expand and then not lose any, connectivity. But the question is, do you actually need some of this bandwidth? Is completely another topic which we might explore in the future. Then we have the AMD system here for the Ryzen 5000, which actually has a bit more PCIe lanes and gives you more expansibility. Now, you might pay a little bit of a higher price for the motherboard, but it's because you do get the more or higher m.2 slot generation, PCIe Gen 5, you're not going to lose it, and you can just use both of them, which is pretty interesting. And obviously, if you're running the THREADRIPPER platform, this is where you are gonna be opened up to a whole new world of what you can do with your PC, how you can expand this, what you can add to their storage, in the end use it for a server. However you want to do this, it's absolutely incredible. But the takeaways from this video would be, understand the block diagram, and if you want to populate the m.2 SSD, especially for the operating system, it's very, 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 very important that you don't plug it into the wrong slot. This is one of the biggest mistakes that people do, and you've seen me criticize J2Sense even to that. When they built their PC, they lose some of the bandwidth, but they didn't have to lose it, but just by plugging something into the wrong slot, they might lose some of the bandwidth to the CPU or to the graphics card and so on. So make sure that your OS SSD that you're installing is plugged into the correct slot. It's not always the top slot that will make you lose the PCIe lane bandwidth over there. It depends if the very top slot looks like some of the Gigabyte motherboards do that, but not all of them. When it's Gen 5 on Intel platform, you're most likely going to lose something right now in the Z790, Z690 platforms. But with the AMD is the same. If you don't have the higher end chipset like the X670E, and you might still have some Gen 5 M.2 advertised, just double check that this is the right slot where you want to plug in your OS operating and program SSD, because you might lose some of the bandwidth if you are not very careful and plugging this in. But the good news is the Creator motherboard, like the Z790 Creator motherboard from Asus, whichever one you populate, they're all actually Gen 4 SSDs, which means you're not going to lose any bandwidth to any of the other expansion slots, so you're completely fine. Hopefully this helped you understand the PCIe switching, why this happens, how this works, and next time you're going to be a little bit smarter. Let me know what you think. If anything was still a little bit unclear, I'd love to know from you in the comment section below. But if you are a creator and you want to build the best bang for buck creator PC, meaning the best performance for your money, then check out the build guides in the description below. They're completely free, and there's one for your budget. Whichever one it is, there's upgrades, downgrades in there. I'll explain everything down there. Go check them out. Thank you AMD for sponsoring parts of this video. So if you do want to run more than one GPU in your setup and you're the ultimate creator for 3D or architects or whatever, and you don't want to worry about PCIe lane switching, then check out the THREADRIPPER Pro 5000 series in the description below. It's an interesting platform because it's really got no competition at this point yet, and now it's more affordable than ever. So check it out in the description below, because DDR4, you can get up to 2 terabytes in there, and it's more affordable than ever. Did I say that already? Yeah, I did. So go check it out. Thanks guys. Bye bye.